Lesson 21 starts out with the conjugation of the irregular verb pharaoh, phara, tuli, latus, lata, latum. Note how irregular these principal parts are. You have two R's for the second principal part, only one R for the first. Then it changes drastically to tuli, and then it changes completely to latus, lata, latum. Those are wildly different principal parts that you need to memorize. This verb is common. It means to bear or carry, and when I say bear, I mean like bear a burden. It's the root of words like relate. It's the root of words like refer or ferry boat. But it is highly irregular and difficult to predict. Note the compounds and how irregular they are even. This has two F's, whereas this only has one F. This continues the pattern with two F's versus one F. So you see very quickly that this needs to be memorized. Nothing anybody can do about it. When you learn a language, it starts out maybe with some regularity and ease, and then you start to get to the things that need to be memorized. So these verbs, these three examples, the root verb pharaoh, phara, tuli, and latus, lata, latum, are irregular verbs that have to be memorized. I start out with the indicative present active. You should be able to predict that abbreviation at this point because I always do it mood tense voice. I has to stand for indicative, P is present, A is active voice. The indicative future active and the indicative imperfect active. In short term, your book might call them the present, the future, and the imperfect. But I need you to know the mood, the tense, and the voice for each of these. I've lumped these three forms together because they're the forms that use the second principal part. Not just for this irregular verb, but for all verb conjugations. These three tenses, the present, the future, and the imperfect, use the second principal part, whereas the ones below are ones that use the third principal part. So I've put them together so you get used to seeing them and thinking of them as a unit. These use the third principal part, the perfect, the future perfect, and the pluperfect. But I'll start with the three on top to point out some of their regularities and irregularities. The indicative present active, pharaoh, fares. You might expect F-E-R-I-S, but it does not have the I in between. Then F-E-R-T, same thing, missing the I that you might expect. Then ferimus, feritus, and ferunt. This is more regular. It has the I, and it has the UNT. Almost never in Latin do you see the INT. The next form, the future, is pretty predictable because it has the A, E, 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 E pattern of the third I, and fourth conjugations. Those letters, the A, E, 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 are the sign of the future, followed by the regular old suffixes M, S, T, mus, tis, and ent. Not entirely predictable, but rather regular compared to the present tense. You just have to drill yourself with these, test yourself, and make flashcards. Practice them orally, forward and backward. Don't just always recite them in the same order, and write them out by hand. And then finally, imperfect is fairly regular because it has the ba form throughout each. The regular endings MST, mustis, ent that you're accustomed to for the present, the future, and the imperfect. If you understand the formation of these tenses, this pharaoh does not blow your mind. It's not wildly and completely different, but it's irregular enough that you need to spend some time with it. The next verb tenses are easy as long as you know the principal parts: tuli, tulisti, tulit, tulimus, tulistis, and tulerunt or tulera. Remember, you always have the alternate form ERE as an ending down here. Instead of ERUNT, you could have just ERE after the TUL. So it would be written Tulera in poetry sometimes. This form is perfectly regular as long as you know the third principal part. Third principal part has to be memorized. When you read and you come across Thule, most of you will forget that it's related to Pharaoh because it's spelled completely differently. So you have to memorize these ones above all else. The future perfect, again, is perfectly regular as long as you know the third principal part is TUL. You just add a rho, a ris, a rit, a rimis, a ritus, a rint, as you always have for the future perfect, even for regular verbs. And the same thing applies for the future perfect, the pluperfect. It goes eram, eras, erat, eramis, eratis, erant. As long as you know it's the third principal part, there's a typo there, autocorrect made it tolerant instead of tolerant. The TUL is perfectly regular as long as you know what the endings are. So practice those forms and memorize them because that verb will come up regularly as well as its compound forms. The next topic is more types of third declension adjectives. There are 2-1-2 adjectives like bonas, bona, and bonum. They end with us, and then there are 3-3-3 adjectives. 3-3 adjectives that you know so far are like omnis, omnis, omne. That's its lexical entry. Now, I'm old-fashioned and very deliberate. I write out omnis and omnis even though they're the same. Some books are lazy and sloppy, if you ask me, and they just write omnis, omne. But for the beginning student, I think it's too much to remember and too inconsistent to not write the same lexical entry every time, with a masculine, feminine, and neuter entry for an adjective. What many books call this type of adjective, this type of 3-3-3 adjective, like omnis, omne, omnis, omne, they call that type of 3-3-3 adjective a two-ending adjective or a two-termination adjective. Your book specifically says that it has two terminations, by which they mean omnis and omnis are the same, and then omne is different. So you have omnis omnis and omne. In other words, this adjective type has two different kinds of endings in the nominative. When you look up in a dictionary, the first and the second entry, the masculine and the feminine entry, are the same. And then omne is different, so this is an adjective of two endings or two terminations. That's what you've learned so far for 3-3-3 adjectives. The model is omnis, omnis, omne. There's another type of 3-3-3 adjective, however, that has one ending in the nominative or one termination. And then there is yet another type of 3-3-3 adjective that has three endings. So to spell it out for you, there are adjectives that have in the third declension that have one ending, some have two endings, and some have three endings, so called. That is how most Latinists classify them. Adjectives of one, two, or three endings. I think it's rather silly to focus on the endings. As long as you can look it up in the dictionary and you can understand the lesson, this is not really a crucial point to know how many quote-unquote endings or terminations an adjective has. You've already seen the omnis, omnis, omne variety. That's the adjective with two endings. So here's a model of an adjective with one ending, followed by a model of an adjective with three endings, so-called, or three terminations. Ingens, ingens, ingens only has one ending throughout the nominative lexical entry, whereas acer, acris, acra has three separate and unique endings in the nominative singular, in the masculine, feminine, and neuter. This is how adjectives are always arranged in the dictionary. With adjectives of so-called one ending, the pattern is that the nominatives are all exactly the same, the genitives are all exactly the same. I didn't bother typing them out. The datives are all exactly the same. The accusative is same for the masculine and feminine, but then, of course, like all accusatives in the neuter, it goes back to copying the nominative form. And then all the forms in the ablative are the same. Note that they end with an I, not an E. These adjectives follow the pattern of third declension I stems. In the plural, the nominative masculine and feminine are the same, whereas the neuter is different. Note that it has the I again, the IA. Then ingentium for all genders, ingentibus for all genders, ingentes for the masculine and feminine, ingentia for the accusative. The nominative accusative for all neuters is always the same. And then ingentibus for all three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. Not a difficult pattern to follow as long as you've as long as you've memorized your third declension nouns with an I stem. If you haven't, this is going to get confusing because you're going to get lost between the third declension nouns and the third declension I stems and the different types of adjectives and participles that you have to learn and distinguish. An adjective of three endings follows the pattern of acer, acris, acra. Three distinct endings in the nominative. All the genitives are exactly the same. All the datives are exactly the same. The masculine and the feminine accusative are the same. The neuter is different, but it's the same as the nominative. All neuters have the same nominative and accusative. All the ablatives are the same, and note that it is an I stem. And then again, the nominative masculine and feminine are the same, but the neuter is different. The neuter is the same as the accusative. The genitive plurals are the same. Note that it has the I, just like over here. Then acrobus, 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 all genders. Acres, acres for the masculine and feminine. Acria for the neuter. And then acrobus, acrobus, acrobus. Follow this pattern and you know all the different kinds of third declension adjectives. These need to be memorized, but they're not that different from each other really, especially since you don't have to write Latin sentences. You can learn to recognize these very quickly, but write them out and say them out loud in different ways. You'll learn them much faster. The class will go much easier for you. Here's my reminder to you one more time. My reminder is that each of those adjectives, each of those three adjectives are declined exactly like third stem I nouns. Third stem I nouns. In other words, they have an IA in the accusative plural neuter. Their genitive plural, masculine, feminine, and neuter is IUM, masculine, feminine, and neuter are all the same. And the ablative singular, masculine, feminine, or neuter, is always an I. So they have three irregularities, 1, 2, 3. The accusative plural, the genitive plural, and the ablative singular all have an I that normal third declensions do not have. The next point continues to introduce the concept of what a participle is. A participle is an adjective formed from a verb. An adjective describes a noun. A verb indicates the action. But you can take a verb and turn it into an adjective. It's easier to understand this when you see examples from English. Run is obviously a verb. It describes an action. But running is a participle that is formed from that verb, and a participle is an adjective. It's a certain type of adjective formed from a verb. So you could say the running man, running is the adjective that modifies man, the running man looks funny. So running is not a verb in this case. It is a so-called participle that's formed from a verb. But when you use it to modify the noun man, you have to consider that to be an adjective, and in particular, this type of adjective is called a participle. Look at the next example. Love is a verb. Loved is the participle. It's a different participle from the first example, but it's still a participle. The first example is a participle present active. The second example is a participle perfect passive. As usual, you have a mood, a tense, and a voice. Mood, tense, voice. So love is a verb. Loved is the participle. You can say the animal was loved. You're describing the animal with the adjective loved. Loved is the adjective or participle that modifies the noun animal. Eat is a verb. Eaten is the participle. For example, he saw the half-eaten sandwich. How do you describe the sandwich? It was eaten. You could say half-eaten or partially eaten, or you can just say he saw the eaten sandwich, although people don't tend to say that in English. Either way you slice it, that's the participle. It's a verb that becomes an adjective. So participle is considered the mood, and participles come in only the following tenses and voices. It is limited. In the indicative mood, you have all 6 tenses. In the participle, you only have 4 tenses. In the participle, you have the present active, you have the perfect passive, that you've already learned. That's the 4th principal part. That is nothing new. You've already used it and learned how to form it. It's taken straight from the 4th principal part. The participle future active and the participle future passive. So 4 types of participle only. There are 6 tenses total in Latin, but a participle can only use 4 of those tenses. There are 2 voices in Latin, active and passive. Note that there is only one passive participle, the participle perfect passive. All of the other participles are in the active voice. The participle future active and the participle future passive, they will be the subject of later lessons, and you've already learned the participle perfect passive. That's the 4th principal part. That's the 4th principal part with no changes. So today in particular, you're going to learn how to do the formation and declension, because it's an adjective, of the participle present active. That's one of 4 possible tenses that the participle comes in. And the truth is, it is rather complicated to understand its formation. To form it, you take the 2nd principal part, you drop either the re for the first conjugation, the re for the second conjugation, the ere for the third, the ere for the third I, and the re for the 4th. So you drop the re, ere, re, and then you add the following. Pay attention here, this is important. What I'm going to show you first is only the masculine and feminine forms. You're only learning the masculine and feminine forms. In the next screen, I will teach you the neuter forms. If I had unlimited space, I would put the neuter right over here. It would be a little bit clearer to follow. But I can't do that, so first I'm going to teach you the masculine and feminine form. After you drop the re, ere, or re, depending on which conjugation you're dealing with, you add the following. For the nominative singular, you add to that stem, let's say you drop the re from ama. you add ns to it. For a second conjugation verb, that's the first conjugation. For a second conjugation verb, you also add ns. These two conjugations, first and second, tend to behave like each other. That's why you learn them first. For the nominative of the third, you add ens. For the third I, you add ens. That's why it's called the third I. And for the fourth, you just add ens. So again, let me show you an example. If your fourth conjugation verb is audira, you drop the re, just like it shows over here. That's a fourth conjugation verb, so you drop only the re, and then you add ens. That is your nominative singular. When you get to the genitive singular, you take that same stem after you drop the re in the first conjugation, add ntis. Here you add ntis. Then it changes for the third I, and fourth over here, and you add entis, ientis, and just ents again for the genitive. So you can see that the nominative and the genitive forms differ drastically because you get a T after the N for the rest of the conjugation. That starts in the genitive. Then the dative is NTI or NTI, or ENT, IENTI, or ENTI. That's your dative. Slight differences between them, but still worth noting and memorizing. The accusative is, for the masculine and feminine, first and second declension is NTEM, and then E, IE, and E for the accusative. And then the ablative can be either NTI or NTE. Same thing for the second conjugation, masculine or feminine. Then for the third I, and fourth, it's ENTI or ENTE, IENTI or IENTE, or ENTI, ENTE. You have to practice taking the theme. For example, if it's a second conjugation, it's MONE, RE. Since it's second conjugation, you drop the RE, and then you would decline it if you're trying to decline the masculine or the feminine as NS, and then the genitive would be NTIS, and then the dative would be NTI. The accusative for the masculine and feminine would be EM, and so forth and so on, following these patterns in this chart. And don't forget to consult the book, but also the lessons that I post, the written lessons that I post on the Blackboard site, so you can see these lessons, look over them yourself, print them out, and manipulate them, write all over them, so you can practice and learn exactly what you need to memorize. So you've seen now the masculine and feminine form. Now I'm going to show you the neuter form for the first declension, second declension, third I, and fourth. Not a huge amount of difference, but still worth noting. You drop the re, the era, and the re, and then you add ns, ns, ens, iens, and ens. No difference so far from what you did for the masculine and feminine. Remember, what we're doing right now is the neuter. And so far in the nominative, it looks exactly the same as the neuter. You could not tell them apart except from context, and even in context there may be some ambiguity. The genitive is the same story as I just showed you. The dative is nothing new. That's exactly what I just showed you for the masculine and feminine forms. In the accusative, everything is back to the nominative form. Remember that the nominative and accusative for every single neuter always exactly the same. That is not true for the masculine and feminine forms. So the one major difference is that the accusatives are the exact same as the nominatives. That is not the case for the masculine and the feminine. And then for the ablative, there's no surprises. You either end with the I or the E, and it follows the regular pattern of the masculine and feminine as shown above. When you get down to the plural, note that the nominative plural has the IA for the first conjugation, and the second conjugation, and the third I, and the fourth. So that's a difference. You actually have a difference in the nominative plural. You have an IA, not just an A, and not just an ES, as in the masculine and feminine forms. The genitive is regular and predictable. The dative is super easy. The accusative has to be the same as the nominative because this is a neuter. And then you have the regular and predictable ablative. Nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative are all perfectly regular as long as you've understood this pattern earlier in the course. So if you give me an example of a third declension word like dukara, dukara means you have to, it's a third declension, which means you have to drop the ERE. And then if I wanted to do it in the masculine or feminine, nominative would be dukens. The neuter would also be dukens. That's the nominative all the way across. The genitive singular would be ducentis, ducentis, ducentis. The dative singular would be ducenti, 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 and so forth and so on. As long as you know that you take the second principal part, drop the re, era, or re, and add the chart as shown above and in the previous screen, you understand what the participle looks like. Using the participle is just as difficult as forming it. So you have to practice both, and this is an important lesson because the Romans love participles more than anything. Here's what I mean. The participle is an adjective, and so it can modify any noun. But Latin just uses participles so much more than English and so much more differently. It'll take a little time to get used to it, but you'll see what I mean. Look at this first example. Orpheus tendens brachia et curtans iam prehendera. I cut off the rest of the sentence, but you'll see in italics is the noun, Orpheus, and underlined is tendons and curtans. Tendons is a participle modifying Orpheus. Curtans is a participle modifying Orpheus. Note that it ends in ns, so it's a nominative singular, and ns, that's a nominative singular. Those are adjectives that modify the noun Orpheus. So you can tell, since Orpheus happens to be male, that tendons and curtans are nominative, singular, and masculine. Because adjectives agree with the nouns they modify in case, number, and gender, and Orpheus is the nominative, singular, masculine as well. So this sentence says, Orpheus tendons, stretching, or stretching out, his brachia, his arms, and kertons, the adjective, struggling to grasp her. So stretching out modifies Orpheus, and struggling modifies Orpheus. Stretch and struggle are both verbs, but when you add in English the ing, you make them into participles, or at least that's how Latin looks at it. You make them into participles, and then they modify nouns. Second example says, serpens crescentes annos obstulit. It says, the serpent took, serpens obstulit, the serpent took her growing, or increasing, whichever one you prefer, years. The serpens obstulit, the crescentes annos. Crescentes is modifying the noun annos, the growing years, the years that she was still going to pass in her life, the years that were going to go on for decades. The serpent took away her still growing life, her still increasing years. Crescentes is the participle underlined, and annos is the noun that it modifies. They both agree in case, number, and gender. Crescentes is the accusative, plural, masculine, and annos is the accusative, plural, masculine noun. The third example says, the spirits were hearing him speaking such things. The spirits were listening to him speaking such things. The decentum is in the accusative, singular masculine. It's an adjective. It's a participle. It has the nt plus the accusative ending, and it modifies him. The spirits heard him speaking. What was he doing? How do you describe him? He was speaking. You take a verb and turn it into an adjective. And then the sentence continues, and the spirits were crying. So decentum, because it modifies eum, agrees with it in case, number, and gender. Both are in the accusative, singular, masculine. Participle, present, active. All three of these examples were the participle, that's the mood, present, active. And then, even though that looks like a verb identification, you have to remember that a participle is actually an adjective, and so it declines in the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative singular, and the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative plural. A minor point, and something that's boring in this class in terms of it merely needs to be memorized, is the irregular verb io, which means to go. It has the following irregular participle, present, active. The participle, present, active for the verb io, which means go, has the following forms: the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter. It goes ens, ens, ens across the nominative. Iuntis, you see how drastically that stem changes. Iuntis, iuntis, iuntis for the genitive. Iunti, iunti, iunti for the dative. And then, of course, the accusative changes. The masculine and feminine are the same. And the neuter is always the same as the nominative. And then you have the ablative, which has the I or the E at the end. You can pick one or the other, not both, obviously. And that's true for the dative, for the feminine and the neuter. And then the plural follows the same pattern. You should be able to predict that pattern. What I'd ask you to do informally is to write out this whole chart and the whole chart of every example I've shown you in this lesson in particular, so that you learn how to form the participles with great fluency. The Romans love to use participles, and it is not the way that you typically use participles. It'll sound very awkward, in fact, when you start getting sentences with a lot of Roman participles. But you've got to understand them now so that you don't get lost later.